What if the survival rules you follow aren't there to save you, but to feed something ancient? When Eric accepts a night shift at a quiet university library, he expects boredom. Not a twisted game of forbidden rules and supernatural horrors buried beneath the building. Haunted by fractured memories, mysterious rituals, and the terrifying tall man, Eric must navigate a terrifying cycle where, breaking the rules, isn't his biggest fear, following them is. But as reality warps and forgotten debts resurface, one question remains: can you escape a ritual designed to never end? The moment I picked up the manila envelope marked "For the New Night Guard," the overhead lights flickered, once, twice, then plunged the library into a suffocating darkness. My breath froze for those few seconds, until the fluorescent tubes crackled back to life with a low, buzzing hum. I forced a chuckle to settle my nerves, but the echo of my own laugh felt oddly misplaced in the hollow silence. It was my first night on duty. Elder Hollow State University Library, midnight to 4 a.m. I told myself it was just another part-time job to keep my student loans from swallowing me whole. Better this than stacking boxes in some freezing warehouse, I figured. I was wrong. The security desk sat right beneath a towering stained glass window, etched with the university's century-old crest. A pair of intertwined oak trees wrapped around a strange, runic symbol I never quite recognized. The glass cast faint patches of colored light across the marble floor. Even at night, when there should have been nothing but emptiness, the room never felt truly still. The envelope was thick, sealed. My name wasn't on it, but the crude handwriting in red Sharpie, "For the New Night Guard," left no doubt it was meant for me. There hadn't been another hire, and Tori, the guy who trained me earlier that evening, made no mention of anything like this before his quick departure. I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper, worn at the edges like it had passed through many hands. The title at the top was bold, underlined twice: "Rules for Survival." My stomach knotted as I read, "To the New Night Guard. Under no circumstances should you disregard this list. This isn't some hazing prank or idle tradition. These rules are mandatory. They are the reason I am alive to write them. And maybe, if you listen, you'll survive too. If you make it through tonight, I'll leave further instructions tomorrow. Good luck." The rules followed, each numbered. I skimmed them, my eyes widening with every line. Never look into the mirrors in the basement hallway. Keep your eyes down, move quickly. You will encounter a man in a gray suit. Do not look at his face. Respond only with, "No, sir." Avoid the main atrium from 2:15 to 2:16 a.m. Do not attempt to observe what happens there. You may hear disturbing sounds from study room 20,119. Never open that door. If you must access the 4th floor, stay near the western shelves. Do not walk between the center aisles. Should you hear tapping at the glass behind the security desk, do not turn around. At 12:15 a.m., a man in an old tuxedo will rush past holding a leather briefcase. Tell him, "Not tonight, buddy." If he ascends the stairs, it's already too late. By the time I reached the end of the list, my throat had dried completely. My mind raced. Was this some elaborate joke? An initiation rite to screw with the new guy? But there was something in the handwriting, hurried, anxious, desperate, that made it feel too sincere. I glanced at the monitor on the desk, scanning the empty rows of shelves displayed across multiple security feeds. All clear. No one was here but me. Or at least, no one I could see. The air carried a faint chill, though the heating system hummed steadily. Somewhere far off, I swore I heard a door creak shut. I told myself it was just the old building settling, wood expanding, pipes contracting, or whatever excuse my brain could muster. I shook off the unease and focused on my assigned tasks. The schedule was simple. Stay at the desk for the first 30 minutes, complete paperwork, then begin a full patrol of the library's 4 levels. 3 miles of slow walking in total, according to Tori. The clock read 12:07 a.m. A faint knock made my head snap up. It was barely audible, like fingernails tapping rhythmically on glass. My skin crawled as I remembered Rule 6, do not turn around. The tapping continued, first slow, then quickening into an erratic, frantic tempo. It wasn't a tree branch or some animal. It was deliberate, human, and it was just behind me. I clenched my fists against the desk's wooden surface, my heartbeat drumming in my ears. The tapping grew louder still, as though whatever was behind the glass grew agitated by my refusal to react. I squeezed my eyes shut, whispered a prayer under my breath. Don't turn around. Don't turn around. After what felt like an eternity, the tapping ceased. The silence that followed was somehow worse. The clock read 12:14 a.m. A sudden loud bang from the front entrance made me jump from my seat. My gaze darted to the security monitors. Nothing. But I heard it plain as day. A door slamming open. That's when I remembered Rule 7, 12:15 a.m. The man in the tuxedo. Almost like clockwork, I saw movement. My peripheral vision caught a blur dashing across the atrium floor beyond the desk's glass wall. I spun toward it just in time to see a man, portly, mid-50s, dressed in a faded tuxedo, rushing past, clutching a leather briefcase. He was moving fast, panic etched into his wide, sweating face. His tie flapped behind him as he bolted for the stairwell. The words from the rule sheet screamed in my head. Not tonight, buddy. But I froze. My mouth wouldn't cooperate. My brain stalled on the impossible absurdity of the situation. Before I could even call out, he was already bounding up the stairs, disappearing onto the second floor. My chest tightened. My chance to stop him, whatever that meant, was gone. Had I just broken one of the rules? My legs moved on their own. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out from behind the desk and toward the grand staircase, my breath clouding in front of me as though the air had suddenly dropped 10 degrees. The staircase loomed ahead, winding upward like a coiled serpent. My footsteps echoed against the marble floor, unnervingly loud in the otherwise dead silence. Each creak of my boots on the old oak steps sent a shiver crawling beneath my skin. I paused at the first landing, gripping the polished railing as I tried to steady my breathing. The man in the tuxedo had disappeared somewhere above, but there was no sound of his movements now. Only the hum of distant fluorescent lights buzzed softly like a whisper in my ear. I whispered under my breath, as if saying it aloud would make it true. It's just a prank. Somebody's messing with me. But deep down, I didn't believe it. Not anymore. The second floor opened into a wide reading hall. Empty rows of wooden tables stretched beneath arched windows, the moonlight slanting across them like pale blue blades. The silence here was thicker, heavier. The air smelled faintly of old paper and something else beneath it. Something metallic, coppery. I scanned the room, sweeping my flashlight across every shadow. Nothing. No tuxedo, no briefcase. Just the stale air and the creak of the building's bones. Then I heard it. A soft rustling sound, like dozens of loose pages being shuffled rapidly. It came from the far corner, near the restricted archives where government records were kept, locked behind heavy glass cases. The rustling grew more frantic, more violent, as if something, or someone, was tearing through the stacks in a frenzy. Heart hammering, I stepped closer. The beam of my flashlight quivered as I advanced, the noise getting louder with each step. My throat tightened. The shadows between the towering bookshelves seemed to shift and breathe as I approached. The moment I turned the corner, I froze. He was there. The man in the tuxedo knelt on the floor, frantically clawing through stacks of yellowed folders and brittle documents, his briefcase cast aside like an afterthought. Sweat dripped from his balding head, his face contorted in wild desperation. His breath came in harsh wheezes, as though he'd run for miles. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, my voice cracking. He jerked his head toward me, eyes wide with terror. In that instant, he didn't seem like a man at all. He looked like something cornered, something animal. His face was flushed and streaked with sweat. His pupils dilated unnaturally large. "Stay back," he barked, raising the briefcase like a shield. I took an involuntary step backward, startled by his raw panic. This wasn't just some lunatic breaking into the library. Something was very wrong. I don't want any trouble, man. Just put the case down. My voice was shaking. You don't understand, he rasped. They'll ruin me. They'll destroy everything. I just need more time. His hand slipped inside the briefcase. I flinched. For one horrifying second, I thought he might pull out a file or a weapon, or the black pistol gleamed under the flashlight's beam. I froze, instinctively raising my hands. Hey, easy. Please don't. They want to finish it tonight. His voice cracked into a high, broken wail. I can't let them. I won't let them. The barrel of the gun pressed against his temple. No, don't do this, I pleaded. My mouth was dry as ash, but his eyes locked with mine in grim resignation. There's no other way. The shot rang out like thunder in the enclosed space. The muzzle flash briefly illuminated the rain of blood and gray matter that splattered across the stacks behind him. His body crumpled instantly, folding sideways onto the floor as the briefcase clattered beside him. For a heartbeat, everything was silent again. Then the coppery stench hit me. I staggered backward, bile rising in my throat as my flashlight beam trembled over the grotesque scene. Blood pooled beneath his head, seeping into torn files and curling sheets of aged paper. His eyes remained open, glassy and vacant. The briefcase lay partially open beside him. Inside were papers, dozens of them, but they weren't standard documents. Strange diagrams, symbols I couldn't understand, and handwritten notes in panicked scrawl covered the yellowed pages. A crude drawing of a circle with intersecting lines caught my eye. It looked almost ceremonial. Before I could study it further, a sharp voice barked behind me. What the hell are you doing? I spun around. It was one of the Chinese exchange students. He stood there in a hoodie, arms crossed, face twisted in irritation. Get away from there, I shouted, stepping between him and the corpse. You shouldn't be here. Something happened. The student squinted past me, scanning the empty corner. His eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? There's nothing there. I blinked. The words didn't register. What do you mean? He's right here. He shot himself right in front of me. He shook his head, annoyed. You're trying too hard, man. The whole scary night guard act? Not funny. No? You don't understand. My voice broke. I turned back toward the blood-stained scene, but there was nothing. The floor was clean. No blood. No body. No briefcase. The government records were stacked neatly, untouched. I staggered. My mind reeled. The student muttered something in Chinese under his breath, scowled at me one last time, and walked away toward the stairwell. If you're gonna pull this kind of crap, at least don't wake up the rest of us. His footsteps faded into silence as he disappeared upstairs. I stood there alone, my breath heaving, heart hammering against my ribcage. My hands trembled. My legs felt weak beneath me. I knew what I had seen. I knew what had happened, but somehow it hadn't. My eyes darted to the clock on the wall, 12:41 a.m. Still nearly 20 minutes before the last of the students would clear out, and then I'd be alone, completely, utterly alone, for the next 3 hours. I backed away from the corner and returned to my desk, my vision blurry with confusion and dread. The envelope with the rules lay there like a silent judge, daring me to continue reading. I clutched it tightly, my knuckles white. Whatever was happening in this library, it was real, and it was only just beginning. The clock on the security desk ticked over to 12:55 a.m., but my sense of time was already unraveling. I kept staring at the surveillance monitors, hoping to see something, anything, that would make sense of what had just happened. But the cameras showed nothing. Clean shelves, empty corridors, silent rooms. The man in the tuxedo, the self-inflicted gunshot, the pool of blood, gone. As if it had never happened. No proof, no trace. I rubbed my eyes, forcing my hands to stop shaking. My stomach still churned with nausea. My mind clung desperately to logic, but the creeping sense of something unnatural wormed deeper into my thoughts. This is real, I whispered. I know what I saw. The envelope with the rules sat on the desk like a coiled snake. I reached for it again, scanning every word, searching for anything I might have missed. At 12:15 a.m., a man in an old tuxedo will rush past holding a leather briefcase. Tell him, not tonight, buddy. If he ascends the stairs, it's already too late. I had failed. I froze at the crucial moment, and now something had shifted. Like I'd stepped off the edge of the map and into uncharted territory. The cameras continued their slow, lazy pans, and my attention locked onto the feed from the eastern stairwell. Something flickered in the corner. At first, I thought it was just pixelation, artifacting from the old system. But then the shadow shifted, unnaturally, like someone was standing just out of frame. My blood ran cold. A voice crackled over the library's old PA system. An automatic message I'd already heard once during training. Attention, the library will be closing in 10 minutes. Please make your way to the main exit. It sounded benign, comforting even, but it wasn't meant for me. That message was for the students still lingering on the 3rd floor. I lifted my gaze as 2 of the Chinese exchange students wandered past the front desk, chatting softly in Mandarin. One of them glanced at me, offering a half smile. "Crazy night, huh?" he said. I tried to match his expression, but probably looked as pale as death. "Yeah, something like that." They filed out through the main doors, and the heavy locks clicked behind them automatically. I watched the time tick down. 1:05 a.m. The next 3 hours would be mine alone. I swallowed, leaning back into the creaky swivel chair. But I couldn't sit still. My body was tense, coiled like a spring. Every tiny sound, the low hum of the HVAC system, the crackle of aging light bulbs, even my own breath, felt unnaturally loud. As the silence thickened, my thoughts turned back to Tori, the previous night guard who left this job just days before I started. He'd been the one to write these rules, to leave this warning behind. Why had he left? What had he seen? I wanted to call Valerie, to hear a familiar voice, anything human. But my phone had no signal, just like earlier tonight. The dead zone wasn't surprising in this old building, but the timing of it unnerved me. I stood up abruptly. I couldn't stay still anymore. If I was going to survive this night, I needed to move. I needed to follow the routine. The patrol. I grabbed my flashlight, tucked the envelope into my jacket pocket, and stepped away from the desk. The library transformed as I moved deeper into its halls. The silence wasn't emptiness, it was presence. Heavy, oppressive, watching. The shadows along the aisles felt alive, stretching unnaturally long beneath the cold fluorescent glow. When I reached the 2nd floor again, I instinctively glanced toward the restricted archives where the man in the tuxedo had shot himself. The space was perfectly clean, not a single disturbed file. The glass cases reflected my own pale face back at me, gaunt and wide-eyed. I backed away from the memory and kept moving. At the far end of the hall, near the emergency stairwell, a draft whispered out from beneath the stairwell door, carrying with it a faint scent. Something sweet and metallic, like rotting fruit mixed with rust. My stomach tightened. Then I heard it again, a soft, deliberate shuffle from above. The 4th floor. That wasn't possible. The 4th floor was off limits at night, reserved for faculty archives locked behind reinforced doors. No one was supposed to be up there. I debated whether to investigate or stick to the patrol route. Then the elevator dinged. I froze mid-step. My heart skipped. The elevator cabin, inactive all night, had suddenly come alive. The doors slid open on the 2nd floor, empty. But inside, on the panel, the 4th floor button was lit. Someone, or something, had called it down. The temperature seemed to plummet as a sharp gust of cold air rolled out of the cabin. My breath fogged, visible in the flashlight's beam. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. A whisper, so faint I nearly doubted I heard it, drifted through the air. "Not tonight, buddy." I spun around. The hallway was empty, silent. But the words hadn't come from me. And they weren't a memory. I backed slowly away from the elevator, my flashlight quivering. I needed to get back downstairs, at the desk, where at least the rules were close, my lifeline. As I reached the top of the staircase, I paused for just a second, and that's when I saw it. In the center of the grand atrium below stood a man, the Tuxedo Man. But this time, he wasn't moving. He stood rigid, unmoving, as though frozen mid-step. His back was to me. The briefcase dangled from his fingers, swaying slightly as if disturbed by a draft that didn't exist. My throat went dry. He shouldn't be here. The rules never said anything about him returning. I swallowed hard and whispered, almost instinctively, "Not tonight, buddy." At the sound of my voice, his head jerked unnaturally to one side. Too sharp, too quick. Like a puppet on a snapped string, I clamped my mouth shut and darted down the stairs 2 steps at a time, refusing to look at him again. When I reached the bottom, the atrium was empty once more. I stood in the middle of the atrium, gasping for breath, my chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven bursts. The silence around me felt heavier than ever, almost like a living thing coiled tight against my skin. I spun in place, sweeping my flashlight across the vast space. But there was nothing. No man in the tuxedo, no briefcase, no trace of anything that had stood here just seconds ago. I swallowed hard, my tongue dry as sandpaper. My mind reeled. Was I losing it? Were the rules somehow bending? I clenched my fists, trying to ground myself. The damn rules. They weren't suggestions, they weren't games, they were real. And something had changed the moment I failed to stop him the first time. The clock on the far wall ticked over to 1:20 IE, still hours to go. I forced my legs to move again, keeping my back toward the center of the atrium as I slipped back toward the security desk. The dim overhead lights buzzed with a faint electrical whine, casting pale halos across the marble floor. As I approached the desk, my phone buzzed violently inside my jacket pocket. The sudden vibration made me flinch. I yanked it out, hope flaring briefly in my chest. No signal. But there was a new notification, a voicemail. The screen said it had been received exactly 1 minute ago, though my phone had been on 0 bars all night. My thumb hovered over the play button. Every instinct screamed not to listen. But curiosity, or maybe desperation, won. I pressed play. Static poured through the speaker first, sharp and grating, then a voice. Distorted, warped. "You should have stopped him." My blood turned to ice. The voice wasn't mine. It wasn't Tori's. It wasn't anyone I recognized. But somehow, impossibly, it sounded like it had come from inside the library itself. There was another burst of static, followed by a wet, heavy breathing sound. Then the message ended abruptly. I stared at the phone, my pulse hammering in my ears. My skin crawled. This place, this building, was playing with me. The rules weren't just guidelines. They were a map of traps, each one waiting to be triggered. I glanced at the camera monitors again, scanning for any signs of movement. The feeds rolled slowly across empty halls and silent reading rooms. Then I saw him again. The Tuxedo Man. This time he was standing directly beneath one of the cameras on the 3rd floor, his head tilted slightly upward, as though he knew exactly where the lens was. His face remained obscured by the angle, but I could see his shoulders rise and fall with unnatural, jerky movements, like something inside his chest was pulling against him. I slammed my hand against the desk, heart racing. He shouldn't be there. According to the rules, after 12:15 he was done. That encounter was supposed to be it. But this wasn't over. Not yet. The lights above flickered again. 1, 2, 3 times. Then they stayed dimmed, barely illuminating the atrium. I grabbed the envelope once more, scanning the rules like they might magically change and offer me new guidance. But the same list stared back at me. The air around me grew colder and a low hum filled my ears, vibrating inside my skull. I wasn't safe anymore. I took a deep breath and made a decision I instantly regretted. I had to see him up close. I had to know if I could stop him before something worse happened. Every step up the staircase felt like dragging my feet through wet concrete. My muscles screamed at me to turn back, but my legs kept climbing. The third floor stretched out ahead like a dark, yawning throat. I moved slowly, my flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the murky air. The stacks on this floor were taller, older, and more claustrophobic than the rest of the library. The walls closed in tighter here, as though they wanted to keep me trapped. I rounded the first corner near the faculty archives, and then I saw him. The man in the tuxedo stood perfectly still at the end of the aisle. His back was to me again. The briefcase dangled limply from his right hand. This time, his suit was stained dark along the collar and sleeves, wet with something that glistened faintly in the low light. "Not tonight, buddy," I whispered. The words barely left my throat before his head snapped around. Too far, too fast. The motion was unnatural, like his neck was made of rubber. I saw only part of his face, a sliver of cheekbone. Part of his mouth stretched into a wide, broken grin. "You're late," he rasped, his voice like sand scraping against metal. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. My breath hitched as the hallway around us seemed to pulse, warping slightly, like the air itself had become liquid. Then he stepped forward, one slow, dragging step at a time. I retreated blindly, bumping into the shelves behind me. My flashlight flickered wildly, throwing shadows that twisted along the walls. I followed the rules," I choked out. "You're not supposed to be here anymore." He stopped. His head twitched again, his voice low and wet. "The rules changed." A sharp crack echoed from behind me, like splitting wood, and I spun instinctively. For a brief moment I saw movement behind one of the bookcases. A figure slipping through the gaps between the shelves. Not him. Something else. Something bigger. The lights cut out completely. Darkness swallowed me whole. The only sound was my own panicked breathing and the soft drag of shoes against the marble floor, drawing closer, inch by inch. Then, a faint whisper brushed against my ear, cold and breathy. "They're watching!" I bolted. My legs screamed as I sprinted blind, crashing into corners, knocking over stacks of books, my shoulders slamming into walls. I reached the stairwell and stumbled down the steps 2 at a time, barely managing to stay upright. When I reached the security desk, the lights surged back on, casting harsh fluorescent beams across the atrium like nothing had ever happened. But something had. I collapsed into the chair, clutching my pounding chest. And then I noticed it. The envelope. It was no longer where I left it. Instead, it sat neatly upright on the desk, a fresh page tucked inside. New rules. And written across the top in the same desperate handwriting were 3 chilling words. The second list. The second list was shorter. Only 4 new rules, written hastily on another yellowed sheet of paper that smelled faintly of mildew. The handwriting was shakier than before, the ink smudged in places, as though whoever had written it was trembling. But it was the first new rule that stole the breath from my lungs. 1. At 3:00 in.m., you may encounter the tall man. Do not look directly at his face. Respond to any questions only with, "No, sir." I read it over and over, my stomach twisting tighter each time. The tall man. The name alone was enough to make my skin crawl. I didn't know what that meant, but something told me I was going to find out soon. The clock on the wall read 2:41, 19 minutes. I pressed my palms hard against my temples, trying to steady my breathing. My mind was already unraveling from what I'd seen earlier. The man in the tuxedo, the impossible voicemail, the shifting rules. But this felt different. Like everything until now had been an introduction, a warm-up act for what was coming next. I tried calling Valerie again. Still no signal. The entire building had become a perfect dead zone, like something was actively severing me from the outside world. The monitors continued their quiet surveillance, sweeping across the empty hallways in long, slow arcs. The library was quiet again, eerily so, but it wasn't peaceful. It felt like being trapped inside the eye of a storm. Every instinct told me to stay behind the desk, to hide, to wait out the night. But the rules were clear. At 3:00 a.m. it would begin. I couldn't run from it. The clock ticked mercilessly, closer to the hour. 2:52 to 2:56. At 2:59, the building exhaled. That's the only way I can describe it, as though every wall, every shelf, every beam of wood released a long, quiet breath that had been held for far too long. The temperature dropped sharply, and the air grew heavy and damp, as if the humidity itself had thickened. Then, without warning, the power flickered once and died. The library plunged into near-total darkness. The only light came from the dim red glow of the emergency exit signs scattered across the floors. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, heart hammering against my ribs. The rule didn't say where he would appear, only that he would. I moved slowly into the center of the atrium, the beam of my flashlight cutting a narrow cone through the dense shadows. My breath fogged the air in front of me. The silence was oppressive. Then I heard it. Footsteps. But not like any I'd ever heard before. They were deliberate, slow, impossibly heavy, like each step sank several inches into the ground before rising again. The sound reverberated through the marble, vibrating up my legs into my chest. I turned slowly toward the staircase. That's when I saw him. Two pale, impossibly long legs stood motionless at the base of the grand stairwell, perfectly straight, perfectly still. The rest of his body was hidden by the curve of the stairs, but even from here, I could tell his height was grotesque, far too tall for any normal man. The legs alone reached higher than my chest. A wave of cold terror washed over me. I remembered the rule: do not look at his face. The flashlight beam quivered in my hand as I lowered it toward the floor, forcing my eyes to stare only at his shins, never daring to lift my gaze higher. The footsteps resumed. He was moving. I could hear the dull scrape of his soles against the marble floor as he stepped forward, closer, impossibly slow. Each movement seemed to carry the weight of something ancient, something wrong. Then, finally, his voice. It was deep. So deep it felt like it came not from his mouth, but from the very air around me. It vibrated in my chest like low thunder. "I know you are there," the tall man said. I clenched my fists, forcing myself not to lift my head. "You fear me." The words weren't a question. They were a statement. My lips trembled. I spoke the only words I was allowed. "No, sir." For a moment, the silence stretched, taut as a wire. The tall man inhaled, a long, wheezing breath that seemed to last forever. "Do you wish to see me?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "No, sir." The air grew colder still, as though my answer displeased him. I felt the weight of his stare pressing down on me from above like a crushing hand. "You are not like the others," he said, voice rumbling lower now, filled with something that almost sounded like amusement. "You've seen too much already." I fought to keep my breathing steady. "No, sir." His footsteps resumed slow and deliberate, circling me as though inspecting prey that hadn't yet decided whether to flee or, though I never lifted my gaze, I caught glimpses of his form from the corner of my vision. Long, skeletal fingers dangling by his sides. A suit that was not gray, but stained dark by something that glistened in the faint emergency lighting. Then he stopped directly in front of me. The marble floor beneath my shoes glistened, droplets of something thick and dark falling between us. Blood, I realized, or something worse. Another long pause. Then his voice quieter now. "You cannot run from what you are." My knees nearly buckled. My instinct screamed to flee, to look, to do anything but stand still. But the rule held me together like glue. "No, sir." The tall man exhaled once more. The cold breath of it washed over me, carrying a stench of iron and rot. Then, without another word, the footsteps began again, this time retreating. I dared not move. For what felt like hours, though it could have been seconds. I stood frozen, head bowed, waiting for the crushing presence to vanish completely. Finally, silence. I looked up. The stairwell was empty again, but streaks of wet, dark stains marked the marble, trailing up the steps toward the higher floors. I stumbled back toward the desk, my knees weak, heart still hammering out of rhythm. The clock ticked over to 3:11 a.m., and the night was far from over. I sat behind the security desk again, my hands still trembling as I stared at the silent monitors. The cold hadn't left me. It had soaked into my bones, settled deep in my chest like a stone lodged behind my ribs. The tall man was gone. For now. But the echo of his voice, that subterranean growl vibrating inside my skull, refused to fade. "You cannot run from what you are." The words looped through my mind, as if he had planted them there like a seed that would grow long after he disappeared. I checked the clock. 3:17. I am less than an hour left. I should have felt some relief, but instead every passing minute stretched into an unbearable weight pressing down on me. The waiting was worse than the encounter. The dread of what might happen next chewed at my nerves. The cameras swept across the stillness of the library, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, something, was still watching from just beyond their view. The lenses showed nothing, but I knew better now. I reached for the second list again, my only anchor. There were still 3 new rules left beneath the first one about the tall man. 3 more chances to make a fatal mistake. 2. Do not speak to the woman in white on the 4th floor. She will call your name. Ignore her. 3. If you hear knocking from the basement maintenance door after 3:30 am, do not respond. 4. Do not attempt to leave before 4 o'clock am. The 4th rule was the simplest, and somehow the most terrifying, because it implied that trying to escape this place before the clock struck 4 wasn't just forbidden, but lethal. I rubbed my face with both hands, exhaustion washing over me in heavy waves. My body wanted to shut down, but I couldn't allow myself to drift. If I did, if I let my guard drop even for a second, I knew something would come for me. The intercom buzzed suddenly, a high-pitched whine that made me flinch. I stared at the panel. No one should have access to the system but me. And yet, through the speakers, a soft, familiar voice broke the silence. "Eric." My blood froze. It was her voice. My sister's. The voice I hadn't heard in 13 years. "Eric," she called again, softer now, almost pleading. My stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't possible. She was gone. Gone for so long that sometimes I questioned if I'd invented pieces of her memory just to keep her alive inside my head. And yet, her voice filled the empty library now, dripping from the speakers like water leaking from the ceiling. "Eric, come upstairs." I squeezed my eyes shut, shaking my head violently, as if that might break whatever spell was settling over me. The rule. I had to remember the rule. Do not speak to her. Do not respond. A sharp metallic knock echoed from the 4th floor above me, as if a chair had been shoved aside. I opened my eyes and stared up into the darkness spiraling above the grand staircase. The emergency lights flickered again, casting shadows that danced like figures swaying gently in the unseen breeze. "Eric, it's me," the voice whispered again, softer now, almost tender. "Don't you want to see me?" Tears welled up unbidden in my eyes. The longing in her voice was a blade sliding slowly into my chest. I clenched my fists so tightly that my nails bit into my palms. "You're not her," I hissed under my breath. "You're not real." The intercom buzzed one final time before falling silent. The quiet that followed was worse. It felt like something was waiting for me to respond, hoping I'd crack. I didn't. The clock read 3:29 a.m. 1 minute until the basement knocking. I took a shaky breath and stood. Sitting still was suffocating. My legs felt like iron bars as I moved toward the atrium center again, flashlight gripped like a weapon in my hand. The ground beneath my feet vibrated faintly, as though something enormous shifted deep under the foundation of the building. The air was denser now, heavy, electric. I crept toward the basement stairwell, feeling the weight of every creaking step as I descended. The maintenance door loomed ahead, sealed with a rusted padlock. Beyond it, thick darkness pressed against the small wire glass window. My breath fogged the glass as I leaned in slightly, and then it came. The knock. Soft at first, deliberate. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. Pause. Then again. The rhythm was steady, unhurried, like whoever or whatever was behind that door wasn't in a rush. Like it had all the time in the world. My skin crawled with every tap, my gut twisting tighter and tighter. Do not respond. I backed away from the door slowly, resisting the compulsion to even breathe too loudly. The knocking continued behind me, patient and steady, following me like a heartbeat as I returned to the stairs. I climbed quickly, the knocking fading behind me like a dying echo. By the time I reached the atrium again, the clock read 3:36 a.m. 24 minutes to go. My hands were ice cold, my body drenched in sweat despite the chill. The rules weren't just warnings, they were conversations, negotiations, with things I couldn't understand. Every interaction was a test, an invitation. One word, one glance, one mistake, and I'd be gone. As I collapsed back into the chair, my eyes drifted to the cameras again, and there, on the feed for the 4th floor, stood a woman. She was dressed in white, her head lowered, her long hair hiding most of her face. She stood perfectly still in the center of the empty reading room, directly beneath one of the emergency lights. My sister. No. Not her. I forced myself to whisper aloud, to remind myself, she's not real. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge the camera, but somehow I felt her gaze pulling on me, even through the grainy black and white footage. The library exhaled again, as it had before. The lights buzzed softly, and then, as the minute hand crept toward 3:37, the screen blinked. The camera feed cut out. The monitors went black. For several long seconds, I sat frozen, staring into the dark screens as if they might flicker back to life, as if they might somehow undo the nothingness pressing down on me. But the static never returned. Just silence. Just darkness. The clock glowed faintly on the wall above the desk. 3:37 a.m. The power hadn't failed entirely. The emergency lights still buzzed, low and dim, casting long, shifting shadows that danced across the polished marble floors. But the camera feeds were gone. The building had taken away my eyes. I was alone again. No, the truth was worse. I was no longer sure I was alone at all. A soft creak groaned from somewhere above, like old wood shifting beneath invisible weight. My head jerked toward the sound instinctively, but I caught myself before I could move. The 4th floor. The woman in white. I shut my eyes for a moment and exhaled, forcing my breath to slow. The rule was simple. Do not speak to her. Do not respond. Do not engage. I repeated it like a prayer, over and over, even as my hand shook and my pulse pounded through my temples. The cold sweat on my skin made every whisper of air feel like icy fingers dragging across my neck. The library groaned again. And then I heard her footsteps, soft, deliberate, directly above me, pacing the 4th floor's wooden panels. The sound carried easily down the open stairwell, each measured step a slow, deliberate tick-tock, counting down to something I couldn't yet see. The air thickened. The walls felt closer now, like the building itself was drawing in around me, collapsing the distance between every hallway, every stairwell, every corner of darkness I couldn't see. I couldn't stay here. My mind screamed at me to flee, to bolt through the main doors and into the early morning air. But the last rule held me prisoner. Do not attempt to leave before 4 o'clock a.m. The consequences of breaking these rules weren't abstract anymore. They were real, physical, alive. I stood up slowly, gripping the flashlight so tightly that my knuckles whitened. My throat was dry, and I could feel my heartbeat pulsing in my fingertips. The act of standing felt like an invitation to whatever might be watching. The fourth floor groaned again, but then something else happened. A cold breeze brushed past me, not from above, but from behind, the basement stairwell. A stale, damp draft crawled along the floor and across my ankles, and with it, a smell, wet stone, rust, and something sweet beneath it, decay masked by time. I turned, my body moving before my mind could stop it. The basement, the maintenance corridor. I remembered Rule 3. If you hear knocking from the basement maintenance door after 3:30 a.m., do not respond. But this wasn't knocking. This was breathing. A long, labored exhale, coming from somewhere deep within the foundation of the building. The kind of breath you feel more than hear. A low, heavy pulse vibrating in your ribcage. I swallowed, tightening my grip on the flashlight, and descended the stairs. Every step down the concrete stairwell sounded sharper, more hollow than before. The emergency lights continued to hum above me, casting faint halos on the damp, stained walls. The maintenance hallway sprawled out like a narrow artery, twisting into the foundation where few staff ever ventured. I'd only seen it briefly during orientation. The space wasn't meant for regular foot traffic, just pipes, wires, old storage. At the end of the hall, half hidden behind a rusted chain-link gate, stood a large metal door bolted into the far wall, the restricted records archive. The one place in this building I hadn't been allowed to see. The place sealed under State Historical Society authority. My breath fogged the air as I approached. The whisper of breath from within grew stronger, more distinct. Steady, almost human, but deeper, like it belonged to something far larger. I stopped just a few feet from the gate. The padlock securing it was broken, fresh. The metal chain that once wound around the gate hung loose, as if it had been snapped by something impossibly strong. The links were twisted and bent like wire. I knew then I had crossed into a part of the building not even the rules had fully prepared me for. The restricted archive. The place where the oldest records were kept. The place where the mirror lived. A faint tapping sound echoed now, but not from behind the door. From above me. I lifted the flashlight and spotted it. At the corner where the wall met the low ceiling, mounted like a forgotten relic, hung an old convex security mirror, its curved surface covered in a thick layer of dust and grime. The first rule: never look into the mirrors in the basement hallway. I froze, unable to breathe. The light of my flashlight caught the surface of the mirror, illuminating just enough of the reflection to see something I wish I hadn't. A figure stood behind me, not close, not touching, but present. Its frame was massive, its head tilted unnaturally, like it was studying me from an angle that no human neck could achieve. Limbs long and thick, its chest heaved in slow, heavy motions, almost like it was breathing along with me. My pulse pounded in my ears, my muscles locked. I dared not turn around. The reflection began to move. It tilted its head back farther, as though arching to watch me from above. The thing's arms dangled low, its fingers long, flexing gently like a puppeteer adjusting his strings. Then it lifted one arm, slowly, until a single, claw-like finger pointed directly at me in the reflection. The gesture was deliberate, an accusation, an invitation, or a warning. I didn't know. The air thickened into something heavy, crushing. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder now, vibrating like a swarm of insects trapped inside the walls. I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to scream. The flashlight flickered in my hand. Then the power surged. The light snapped off entirely, plunging the basement into full blackness. Only my ragged breathing remained, and somewhere in the dark behind me I heard it whisper, "Found you." The voice was close, too close. "Found you." Its whisper wrapped around me like cold breath sliding across the back of my neck. I froze, afraid that even the smallest movement would trigger something I couldn't control. My ears strained against the suffocating silence, waiting for another breath, another scrape, another sign that it was moving closer, but nothing came, only darkness, thick, pressing, absolute. I felt like I was standing inside a void. The emergency lights sputtered once, briefly illuminating the basement in short, painful flashes, each burst of light showing glimpses of the narrow corridor, the gate, the broken lock, and the thick black void that now seemed to pulse behind me like a living thing. I couldn't stay here. My legs screamed for action, muscles shaking under the weight of adrenaline. My hand gripped the flashlight, but it offered no comfort. The beam was weak now, flickering under the strain of failing batteries. My breath came short and sharp as I tried to force my body into motion. Move, just move. I took a single step backward, careful not to make a sound. Then another. The presence behind me didn't follow, or at least, not yet. My back hit the cold concrete wall, and I used it to guide myself further along the hallway, inching toward the stairs without daring to turn around. My head remained low, my eyes never lifting toward the mirror. I reached the edge of the gate, where the rusted metal frame creaked softly as I grazed against it. The whisper returned, softer now, but more intimate, as though it had pressed its mouth directly beside my ear. "You remember." The words struck something deep inside me, a place I'd long buried under layers of denial and faded memory. My sister's face flickered in my mind, her voice, the way she used to call my name. Before everything fell apart, I squeezed my eyes shut. "No," I whispered back. "You're not her." A low chuckle echoed from behind me, inhuman, wet, guttural. But it didn't move. I stumbled up the first stair, desperate now, practically climbing on all fours as I ascended. My knees scraped against the rough edges, but I didn't care. I needed distance. I needed light. I needed the rules. When I burst into the atrium, the emergency lights flickered weakly but held. The entity didn't follow me up, but its presence still pressed against the edges of my mind, like fingers trailing behind my thoughts, tugging at old, broken memories. I collapsed into the chair behind the desk, chest heaving. The rules sat where I left them, that yellowed paper a fragile barrier between me and whatever that thing was. My eyes darted to the clock. 3:47 a.m. 13 minutes. So close, but I knew it wasn't finished with me yet. As if in response to my thought, the intercom crackled again. That old static hiss returned, followed by a voice, hers again, my sister. "Eric," the voice crooned gently, like a melody. "You always forget, don't you?" I clenched my teeth, rage and grief warring inside me. The voice softened, becoming childlike, almost pitiful. "It wasn't your fault." I slammed my fist onto the desk. "Shut up!" The intercom popped, the sound cutting off abruptly, as though something yanked the cord from the wall. The rules had never said the voices would stop, but the whispers were learning now. They were adapting. They were searching for cracks. I pressed my palms hard against my temples, trying to steady myself. That's when the knock came. Soft, from the far side of the atrium. Not from the basement this time. I turned my head slowly toward the source. At the far end of the reading hall, beyond the last rows of shelves, stood the woman in white. She hadn't been there before. The cameras were gone, but even without them, I knew she'd arrived silently, like she'd simply always been standing there. Her head hung low, long dark hair cascading like a veil, masking her face. The dress she wore was old, stained slightly yellowed by time. Her bare feet were motionless against the marble floor, but somehow she swayed gently, as though caught in an unseen breeze. I didn't move. Neither did she. The library's hum deepened around us, vibrating in the bones of the building itself. Then she raised her head, only slightly. Not enough for me to see her full face, but enough for me to see her mouth. She was smiling. "Eric," she whispered softly, though her lips barely moved. "Don't run. You've always belonged here." Her voice was layered now. Not just my sister's, but many voices beneath it. Dozens, maybe hundreds, all speaking as one. I gripped the desk, my knuckles whitening. "You're not her," I repeated through clenched teeth. Her head tilted slightly, unnaturally, like a broken doll struggling to balance. "You called me here," she said. "We've waited." The emergency lights flickered once more. The temperature dropped sharply again. Frost crystallized along the edge of the desk, blooming outward across the wood like spider webs. I forced myself to look away. Focus on the clock. 3:54 a.m., 6 minutes. Her voice grew louder, rising behind me as if wrapping around the entire room. "Stay. Finish what you started. The rules, the rules, the rules. Do not speak to her. Do not engage." I stayed silent. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, the woman dissolved into mist, her form unraveling like strands of smoke whisked away into the shadows. The air rushed back into my lungs, as if the entire room exhaled in relief alongside me, but I knew better. This wasn't over. The worst was still coming. I looked at the clock again, 3:57. 30:57 a.m.e. The seconds dragged like weights tied to my limbs. My chest rose and fell in short, sharp gasps as the air in the atrium pressed heavier with each tick of the clock. The library was changing. The humming had stopped entirely now. No more vibrations, no more mechanical sounds, just silence so deep it felt alive, hungry. Then I heard footsteps, soft, measured, deliberate. Not the heavy, thunderous strides of the tall man, not the shuffling from behind the mirror. These were light, almost careful. A woman stepped into view from one of the far corridors, emerging slowly into the dim cone of light from the remaining emergency lamp. She wasn't the woman in white, she was real. Her coat was long and old-fashioned, the deep navy wool frayed at the sleeves. Her hair was silver, pulled into a tight bun that revealed sharp cheekbones and hollow eyes that gleamed under the low light. For a second, I couldn't speak. She was the first living person I had seen in hours. Her voice was calm, quiet. "You shouldn't be here, Eric." I stumbled back from the desk instinctively. "Who are you?" "I tried to warn them not to send another one," she said softly. "But they never listen. They never listen because none of them believe what's buried under this place." Her voice was strange, steady, but almost disconnected, like she was reciting lines from some long-forgotten script. I gripped the edge of the desk, steadying myself. "How do you know my name?" She took a few more slow steps forward. "Because this isn't the first time you've been here." My head spun, my pulse pounded at my temples. "That's not possible," I said. "I've never—" "You have," she interrupted gently, her eyes narrowing. "You were here before the others, long ago, before the library was even renovated for the university, before the new records buried the old ones." Her words landed like sledgehammers, shaking loose pieces of memory I didn't recognize, fragments that didn't belong. "You survived the offering." The room tilted beneath me. My knees buckled slightly, and I nearly lost my balance. "What? What are you talking about?" Her face softened, not with kindness, but with pity. "You were just a child. You were chosen like so many others. But your sister, she interfered." I felt bile rise to the back of my throat. "No." "She took your place, Eric," she whispered, and the ritual failed. The binding was incomplete. The tall man never received his prize, and so the loop remained broken until now. The emergency lights flickered violently. The entire library groaned like an animal stirring from sleep. My breath came faster, ragged. My sister, my memories of her, the vague flashes of screaming, of stone chambers beneath the building, of blood smeared across cold concrete, all surged forward like a flood breaking through thin glass. And yet, none of it made sense. I stared at the woman. "Who are you?" "I was the first," she said. "The one who helped them build this place. To contain him." Her eyes drifted up toward the towering glass crest above the atrium, where the university's seal loomed like a watchful eye. "But you can only contain something like him with offerings, with rules, with sacrifice." The air crackled as another cold wind blew through the room. The rules. The lists weren't warnings, they were instructions. Instructions to keep the thing contained. "He's waking now," she continued. "Your presence, your blood, it's calling him back." "No," my voice cracked. "You cannot run from what you are," she whispered, echoing the tall man's words. The clock ticked. 3:59 a.m. The light surged once more. And then the ground beneath us trembled. A deep, guttural noise rose from the basement, low and resonant like a horn being blown beneath the earth. The sound carried through the beams of the library, shaking the glass in its frames. The woman's eyes flicked toward the stairwell leading down. "It's begun." I followed her gaze and saw what she meant. A heavy door beneath the stairs had opened. It hadn't been there before. Beyond it, a tunnel sloped downward into blackness. The air rising from it was thick and cold, like the breath of a long-forgotten tomb disturbed for the first time in years. The woman turned back toward me. "You've already broken the rules," she said softly. "There's no more hiding. Either you finish what was started, or the cycle begins again, stronger, hungrier." My legs wouldn't move. My mind screamed against itself. Every instinct told me to run, to flee, to leave this cursed place and never look back. But somewhere deeper inside me, a place I had denied for years, I knew she was telling the truth. I had been here before, and I had never truly left. The clock ticked over. 4:00 a.m. The lights flared brightly for a brief moment, then shut off entirely. The Hume died. The library descended into a silence thicker than anything that had come before. But something had changed. This was no longer the same night I'd started. The rules had shifted, and the real ritual was only beginning. Darkness swallowed the library whole. No emergency lights, no monitors, no humming of ventilation or creaks of settling wood. The only sound was my heartbeat, hammering in my ears like a war drum. The old woman's voice emerged out of the void. "It's open now." Her tone was calm, resigned. I couldn't see her anymore, but I could still feel her presence standing nearby. The air pulsed, as though some invisible tide was rising from beneath us, pressing upward against the walls and foundation. The faint smell of mildew had grown stronger, heavier, laced with something coppery beneath. I turned toward the stairwell leading into the tunnel. The new passage was wide, carved roughly into the earth itself. It didn't belong to any modern construction. The stone was ancient, jagged, as though it had been excavated by hand, long before the library was ever built. From somewhere far below, faint echoes pulsed upward, whispers, voices, chanting in a language I didn't recognize, but that made my stomach twist, as if my body understood what my mind could not. "You said, 'This is a ritual,'" I whispered hoarsely. "It always was," the woman answered from the dark. I tightened my grip on the railing, forcing one foot forward onto the stone steps. My legs trembled under the weight of dread, but I kept moving. The air grew colder with each step, the walls narrowing as the tunnel descended into the earth's throat. Behind me, the woman's voice followed, quiet and distant. "You survived it once, but not as you think. The ritual requires blood tied to the first offering. When your sister stepped forward, it broke the cycle temporarily." The stairs wound deeper, and the last flickers of distant light disappeared altogether. I was submerged fully now. The only glow came from my failing flashlight, casting weak, narrow beams ahead. "Why me?" My voice was a whisper, lost inside the stone. The answer was immediate, like she'd been waiting for the question all along. Because you belong to him. The tunnel opened suddenly into a massive underground chamber. I froze. At the center of the room stood an altar. Rough-hewn stone smeared with dried stains, its edges chipped and worn from centuries of use. Symbols I couldn't decipher were etched along the walls, jagged spirals intersecting with crude childlike drawings of figures kneeling beneath towering forms. The tall man was etched repeatedly into the stone, dozens of variations, always too tall, always faceless. Surrounding the altar were remnants of old wooden scaffolds, partially collapsed now, their brittle beams tangled like ribs protruding from a long dead carcass, and lining the floor, bones, human bones, piles of them, arranged neatly into concentric rings around the altar, some yellowed with age, others disturbingly fresh, still glistening under the weak beam of my flashlight. My breath caught. This was where it had always happened. The offering. The real secret hidden beneath Elder Hollow, the place where the tall man had been fed. I stumbled forward, my mind spinning between horror and recognition. My head pulsed with fragmented memories I couldn't place, images that didn't belong, yet felt like mine. Children in white gowns, chanting, hands gripping my shoulders, the stone beneath my knees, the altar rising above me, my sister's screams. I dropped to my knees. The old woman's voice returned, but this time it was different, closer now, as though standing just behind me. You forgot because they made you forget. They needed you pure, unaware. I clenched my teeth. You said she took my place. She offered herself to spare you, the voice whispered, and for a time it worked. But unfinished rituals create debts. The chanting grew louder, but it wasn't coming from the past anymore. It was happening now. The chamber trembled, and the ground beneath my hands pulsed like something alive was stirring deep below. Thin cracks spidered along the floor, releasing brief puffs of warm air carrying the stench of decay and earth. I lifted my flashlight. That's when I saw him. At the far end of the chamber, emerging from one of the deep crevices that split through the stone wall, the tall man unfolded himself into view. His form was even more grotesque here. In the place that belonged to him, his body stretched, impossibly tall, nearly scraping the arched ceiling. His limbs elongated, like dripping tar hardened into shape. His gray suit was now torn, the fabric stained black from countless rituals. His head tilted slowly, as though adjusting to the weight of his awakening. But it was his face, or the lack of one, that made my chest seize. Where his mouth should have been, there was only a jagged, bleeding slit that opened far too wide. And behind that, a flicker of eyes blinked in patterns not meant for human understanding. He took one long, dragging step forward. The ground shook. The whisper returned. Eric. But it wasn't the old woman this time. It was my sister's voice again. Finish what I couldn't. I stumbled back, my heel catching against the bones scattered at my feet. The tall man's arms reached out toward me, his fingers extending into long tendrils that pulsed with a sickly glow. You belong to me. The words weren't spoken aloud. They struck directly into my mind. I clutched my head, screaming against the invasion, trying to resist the pull inside my skull. The rules. The damn rules. But there were no rules down here. The rules were only meant to keep him contained, to delay the ritual. Down here, I was inside the ritual. There was only one choice left, either complete the offering or become part of the dead. The chamber pulsed with life or death. I couldn't tell anymore. The tall man loomed above me, his tendrils writhing slowly, swaying like underwater vines, as though testing the air between us. The chant behind him grew louder, the words slithering across the walls in a tongue I could almost understand, but dared not repeat. The symbols etched into the stone vibrated faintly, glowing with a dull, sickly red. I was shaking, not just from fear, but from something deeper, something older. as if my body recognized this place in ways my mind refused to acknowledge. The fractured memories clawed at my skull, images I couldn't place. But they were mine. I had been here, not just once, many times. I stumbled back toward the altar, the bones crunching beneath my feet. The flashlight in my hand flickered violently, finally giving out with a sad, dying hum. Total darkness, except for him. The tall man radiated his own dim light, an unnatural glow seeping from the cracks in his stretching flesh, casting grotesque shadows against the ancient stone. His faceless head tilted once more. "You returned," the voice hissed directly into my mind. "As you always do." I gasped for breath, clutching at my temples as a searing pain stabbed behind my eyes. The woman's voice returned somewhere behind me, no longer gentle but sharp. "Eric, listen to me." I spun wildly but saw nothing. "You've never truly left this place. Every failed offering resets the cycle. Every attempt to escape only feeds him more." Her voice trembled with urgency now. "But this time is different. You're remembering. That means it can be broken." "How?" I cried out into the void. The tall man took another step forward. His elongated foot slammed into the ground with a dull boom that echoed through my chest like a war drum. "You know how," she whispered. I did. Somewhere deep inside me, I knew. The ritual had always required two. One who offers, one who is offered. My sister had taken my place all those years ago. She had broken the pattern but never ended it. The price had simply been delayed, festering like an open wound. That's why the rules existed, to delay him, not stop him. This was never about surviving the night. It was about containing the debt. "You carry her debt," the tall man's voice echoed again, his tendrils flexing, splitting like roots, searching for soil. "But you may release it." I felt my knees buckle. The floor beneath me trembled as small cracks spidered out from the altar's base, and a gust of warm air pushed upward through them, smelling of rot and damp earth. "You can end this," the woman said again, but her voice was weakening, distant, fading. I stepped closer to the altar, almost pulled by invisible threads. The jagged symbols carved into its surface seemed to shift under my gaze, forming shapes that briefly resembled faces. Screaming, wailing, pleading. A hollow depression rested at its center. I recognized it now. A place for blood, for sacrifice, for payment. But there was no knife this time. The tall man's voice slipped back into my head, more intimate now, wrapping itself around my thoughts like cold silk. "Choose." The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest. My lungs burned, each breath harder than the last. I understood the choice. My blood to replace hers, the final offering, the one that would seal him again. I pressed my palm down onto the jagged stone. The sharp edges bit deep into my flesh, slicing open my skin. Warm blood spilled quickly into the hollow, filling it with a thick crimson pool. The ground shuddered. The chant rose into a violent crescendo. The tall man convulsed. The symbols flared with sudden, blinding light. For the first time since entering the chamber, I saw his full form illuminated. His grotesque, elongated frame twisting in agony as the ritual rattled as unseen winds howled through the chamber, pulling the very air toward the altar. The tall man let out a soundless scream. His slit mouth gaping unnaturally wide, stretching far past anything human. The chamber walls trembled as pieces of stone cracked and fell. The chanting voices fractured into sharp, discordant screams as if hundreds of souls cried out at once, some in rage, some in relief. The ritual was consuming him, the cycle was closing. But so was I. My legs collapsed beneath me, my vision blurred as a numbing cold spread through my chest. The price was being taken, my offering made. "You were almost there," the woman's voice whispered one final time, but I couldn't answer. Darkness washed over me like rising black water. I felt my body being pulled downward, as though gravity had shifted, drawing me into the very foundation beneath the altar, into the debt, into the loop. The last thing I saw before my vision faded entirely was the tall man folding inward upon himself, collapsing like a marionette whose strings had finally been cut. The chamber fell silent. The loop was broken, or so I thought. I don't know how long I drifted in that void. There was no time in that place. No breathing, no sound, only the weightless sensation of sinking into endless black, like falling through thick ink that stretched in every direction. My consciousness flickered, struggling to hold itself together as the world dissolved, and then I heard knocking. Soft, deliberate. 3 knocks, 3 more. The sound snapped through the silence like a needle puncturing my skull. My eyes opened. I was sitting at the security desk again. The monitors hummed quietly, their screens cycling through steady, uneventful feeds of the library's empty halls. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed faintly, casting their pale glow across the marble floors. Everything looked clean, normal. The clock read 12:03 IEM. I blinked several times, my head heavy, my body stiff as though I'd been sitting there for hours or days. It was impossible. I should have been dead. I should still be underground. In the chamber, with him, I sat motionless, my breath shallow, waiting for reality to shift again, waiting for the cracks in this fragile illusion to show themselves, but nothing moved. The envelope sat neatly on the desk. The list. The first list. The one I'd received on my first night here. The paper was smooth, unwrinkled, no blood stains, no signs of wear, like nothing had ever happened, like it was happening again. I reached out slowly and unfolded it. The same 7 rules stared back at me in familiar, nervous handwriting. The survival rules. I read each one carefully, my stomach twisting tighter with every line. But as my eyes reached the bottom of the page, a new addition caught my breath. A handwritten note scrawled beneath the rules, written in the same handwriting, only shakier now. I tried. God help you if you read this. The signature beneath it chilled my blood. Eric. My own name. My hand trembled as I traced the letters. My pulse hammered in my ears. I had written this, but I didn't remember writing it. The door behind me suddenly creaked. I snapped around. A voice called from the entrance. Friendly, cheerful. Hey man, you must be the new guy. It was Tori, smiling casually, stepping behind the desk just like I had seen him do that first night. But this wasn't right. Tori had quit before I started. I'd never met him. And yet here he was, alive, grinning like nothing had ever happened. He extended his hand. Welcome to the overnight shift. You'll get used to the quiet. I didn't take his hand. My head spun as I stared at him. My mouth worked uselessly trying to form words. His face tilted slightly. You okay, man? You look pale. The cameras flickered briefly behind him. On one of the feeds, just for a split second, I saw the tall man standing at the far end of the atrium, still as a statue. Watch, then the image vanished, replaced again by empty halls. The loop. I was inside it, again. No matter how many times I fought, how many offerings were made, the loop always restarted. The ritual never ended. It simply fed on the act of trying to stop it. I wasn't the first. I wouldn't be the last. Tori's voice continued like a distant echo. You'll be fine, seriously. There's a guide the last guy left behind for new hires. He patted the envelope on the desk. I looked down at it, my stomach lurching. A fresh envelope, sealed, waiting for me, waiting for the next attempt, for the next offering. My fingers hovered above it, trembling. The lights buzzed softly overhead. From somewhere distant, or perhaps from deep inside me, I heard her voice again, my sister, whispering like wind across broken glass. Finish what you started. I closed my eyes, trying to block her out, but I knew I never would. The rules weren't meant to save me. They were the ritual. The game was never about survival. It was about feeding the loop. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, and then the knocking started again. Thank you for staying with us through this chilling descent into the endless loop. In a world where rules are written not to protect but to trap, sometimes survival isn't about escaping. It's about understanding that you're part of something far more terrifying than death itself. If this story kept you on edge, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unsettling tales that blur the line between reality and nightmare. Your support helps us dive deeper into the darkest corners of horror storytelling. And remember, some doors were never meant to be opened. We'll see you on the next terrifying night.